Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Evening in with Just Imagine. I'm Nikki Gamble, and this evening I am absolutely thrilled that we are going to be spending our evening in the company of James Mayhew for the launch of his latest book, my book of classic nursery tales. It's going to be an evening of conversation and storytelling and art, and there will be an opportunity, I hope, for you to ask some questions at the end. So I'm going to welcome James. Thank you, Janessa, for that really warm introduction. I have to say it's an absolute privilege to talk to James, so no thanks are needed on that score. And I have to say I look forward to these annual chats, James, because I always learn something new when we're in conversation together. Just so our audience are aware of how it's going to go this evening, you and I are going to talk a little bit first, and then you're going to treat us to some storytelling. More about that later. We're going to have a chance as well to look more closely at the pictures. So we just gave a little taster in the introduction there, and we'll be having a look at those more closely as the evening goes on. And I will open, as I promised I would, the Q&A. So that is open. We won't take questions yet, but you can start to add them in the Q&A if you would like to. So, a gorgeous book. It's already been said. It's definitely one that you want to get into your hand and hold. The production quality is superb. And it's called My Book of Classic Nursery Tales. So in a way, I'd like to start our conversation there with how you defined a nursery tale. Yes, I mean, let's start there.
It was a really interesting project to be asked to do, and it kind of came about because with Once Upon a Tune and A Symphony of Stories, I've done a lot of retelling of traditional stories, myths, and legends, and I've discovered that it's something I really love to do. So I mentioned this to Janetta, and simultaneously, the designer, Judith Discreet, who's been fantastic. Thank you, Jude. Um, she saw some of the art in A Symphony of Stories that was very young. The piece on Carnival of the Animals was very young, and I'm using this collage technique, which we'll talk about later. And I wasn't expecting it to work for such young stories, but it kind of did in the Carnival of the Animals. So with all these conversations going on, Jeanette asked me to look at the nursery tales, and that's when the conversation began. And we thought, well, what is a nursery tale? Should we even call them nursery tales today? And we decided that yes, we should, because it was going to be a companion to Jackie Morris's nursery rhymes book. But then we started to explore what nursery tales might be. And of course, it varies. Everybody interprets it slightly differently. I've got books here which are called nursery stories, actually, this book, which includes what I consider fairy tales. All of them are traditional tales, but fairy tales are usually more romantic stories, princes meeting princesses, that kind of happy ever after structure. Whereas nursery tales tend to be a little bit more cautionary, sometimes moral, certainly, and they tend to be animal tales, actually. So that was one of our rules of thumb. All the stories were going to feature animals prominently. Little Red Riding Hood does have a wolf, so it does feature an animal, but that's the least animal-led story in the book. All the others are very animally, and that helps keep it young as well and seems to suit the idea of nursery tales. So it was over many, many conversations, actually, that we decided what the contents should be and how we whittled it down to what we considered to be nursery tales.
Because the whole notion of nursery tale is something that we've ascribed to it, because in terms of the origins, if you like, they are no different to fairy stories. It's more how we've appropriated them for the
Yeah,
nursery
yeah,
because of their suitability.
absolutely. And that's another really interesting conversation because when you start looking at what we might consider to be nursery tales and their suitability, some of them are really unsuitable, in my view. There are stories that I didn't include because I just found them too unsettling. I remember as a child having lots of the Ladybird books, well loved tales, and one of them was The Wolf and the Seven Little Kids, in which the wolf, having eaten the kids and is sleeping to digest them, is cut open. And the kids escape. Boulders are put in his stomach. His stomach is stitched up. The illustrations in those Ladybird books were very detailed, quite realistic, almost on the point of being lurid. And there was a terrifying image to me as a child of this wolf staggering around when he wakes up with all the stitches down his swollen belly. So that was one I did not want to include. And all of the stories, I mean, even if you look at the ones I have included, the gingerbread man is quite brutal, really. He does get eaten by the fox. The wolf does get scolded in some versions to death by the three pigs, not in my version. In some versions of Little Red Riding Hood, the older versions, the grandmother and Little Red Riding Hood don't escape the wolf. So there are all these different variations to explore, all these problems to solve, really, in terms of deciding what my version is going to be. But yeah, and how appropriate they are, because yeah, some of them are quite shocking when you go back to their source material.
Mm. We're going to get into what stories you have included in a moment. But before we do that, I just wanted to have a conversation about whether you would class these are not stories that you've included, but I wondered whether you would give them the title of nursery tale. The Ugly Duckling.
Yes, I would.
Okay.
Although
So
that's a
Elf.
slightly odd one because it has as a known author. That's one of the reasons it didn't go in. Aesop, of course, is linked to Tortoise and the Hare, but generally we wanted to have what we call traditional tales rather than authored tales.
So the Elves and the Shoemaker would also fit into that category,
Yes.
and so would the Emperor's New Clothes. Those could be nursery tales, but not The Nightingale and the Rose, the Oscar Wilde story.
No, I feel that's too sophisticated.
Mm. And Beauty and the Beast.
That's a fairy tale. That's a romance.
Mm. So we're really clear about what this territory is. And I suppose the next question then is, why are they so important for children's early reading repertoire?
I think there are so many reasons, actually. I've been thinking about this a lot lately because I've had a few interviews and a few conversations with people. I think fundamentally they're great stories. They're really enjoyable stories. They're slightly bonkers stories in some ways, and I think children like that. I think they like the the fact that some elements are irreverent and some elements are quite naughty and some elements are just plain daft. So they're just great stories. They have survived all these years, and the reason they've survived is because they're good stories. But beyond that, I think there are many, many other reasons. Firstly, the structure of them. I think it's really helpful for children and actually for grown-ups, adults too, to have stories which have a clear structure. It's a great tool for teachers to look at traditional tales, which I know they do, and understand that structure. Things in threes, we have three billy goats and three piggies and three bears, and events happen in triplicate as well sometimes. So that's a good, useful structure for helping children learn about how stories work. There are repetitions of language. Trip trap over the bridge. Oh, what big eyes you have. Oh, what big teeth you have, Grandma. Um, by the hair of my chinny chin chin. These little refrains, which are very, very old and have survived almost every retelling. These repetitions are a delight to children because they anticipate them, they learn them, and it makes it joyful because they can join in and be part of the process of hearing the story. But I think the other really important thing is that these have entered into our cultural language, our whole understanding of story, and are referenced so many times in modern filmmaking, in television, in other books. There are books about the three wolves and the big bad pig, for example. So it's great that these stories get subverted. It's great that they get played with and people make jokes about them. But if you don't know the original story, then none of that humor is going to work on a child. It's not going to mean anything. So children do need to know the original source material so that when they read the other mixed up versions, they can understand how clever the humor is.
I think there's a difference, isn't there, between a different version of the story that has emerged and evolved through storytelling, because we know there are different versions of these stories all over the world, and one that is knowing and knowingly making a joke out of an original tale. So it's not only that it's about a different version, it's to do with the type of storytelling.
Absolutely. I think that's a really important point. Um, the difference between, as you say, decisively deciding to turn something on its head and flip it, as opposed to a storyteller just bringing in their own personality into the story and maybe changing small subtle things, as I have done in the stories. I've added certain little details. For example, in Red Riding Hood, most of the versions, I think all the versions I read, the woodcutter who appears at the end is just a random woodcutter who happens to be nearby. And that's never made any sense to me. So in my version, he is Red Riding Hood's father. He's referenced at the beginning of the story. We don't see him, but he's mentioned, so that when he appears at the end, it kind of makes an arc in the story, which makes sense. So little tiny tweaks like that. And there are many, many others that I could talk about. There's lots of little um, personal things that I brought into my retellings.
Tell us about a couple more then, while we're on that as a run.
Well, I mean, I think it's things like in Goldilocks and the Three Bears. That's always been an odd story to me. And actually, if you do research and go back to the sources, it was actually an angry old woman who breaks into the bear's house. And it was much, much later in the story's history that the old woman was replaced with this pretty, innocent girl with golden hair. And of course, she's not innocent at all. And in a lot of the stories and a lot of the versions that I've read from, let's say, 100 years ago or thereabouts, or even 50 years ago, she's the sweet, innocent party, and the bears are big and terrible, and she runs away. And I suppose the story is warning people not to go wandering off into dangerous places. But I always felt that she was uh, really, really rather a naughty little girl, and so I've tried to emphasize that, not by making her unpleasant, but by making the bears very agreeable. So the bears are very civilized. They're all dressed. They have a very nice house. Obviously, they have beds and chairs and bowls of porridge. So of course they're going to be nice and civilized creatures. So I really wanted to emphasize that, and really kind of encourage people to realize that the bears are the good guys here, and Little Red Riding Hood is the villain.
Mm. There's so much in what
Sorry,
you've said.
Goldilocks. Goldilocks is
Oh,
the villain.
yes, I'm with you. There's so much in what you've said. I mean, today you were talking about the importance of the structure of stories. Today we talk about really developing your schema for the story, and you kind of hold those templates for stories in your head if you've had experience of them early on. You've talked about memorable language joining in. I bet our audience and certainly I can remember all of those refrains that if we were lucky enough to have these stories shared with us when we were younger, we remember them just like we do with the nursery rhymes all the way through our lives. It's memorable language. And along with the words comes the rhythm of story and the rhythm of rhyme. There's one other thing that I think you were talking about, shared culture, and there's a fantastic storyteller who you probably know, James. She died a few years ago, but Grace Hallworth, who used to also be a librarian in Hertfordshire, talked about stories being the sharing of common humanity. And I think that is really, really important, that notion that we have these connections through these traditional stories. And while we're talking about connections, maybe you could take us on to tell us which stories you decided to include and why.
Again, this was a long conversation with me and Janetta making decisions. There were some stories I suggested which Janetta just didn't feel were right and didn't particularly like. For example, we considered the Musicians of Bremen, which is a story I have told at events, but it didn't make the cut. So it took a while, and I think one of the factors for me was to try and balance the stories in a way that there was a variety of situations, but also a variety of cultures represented. Because through my research, I found out all sorts of interesting things about where the stories came from or where they were first published. So they all have the stories all have interesting stories. So I used that knowledge, newly acquired, to make those decisions about which stories should go in, and to try and have a good representation of lots of different cultures.
Mm. So take us through the contents then.
Okay, so we have Goldilocks and the Three Bears, obviously,
Yes.
and we think of that as an English story. Explain in my notes at the back that it was first published in England, but actually there's a handwritten version which predates it that's been found in a library in Toronto, written by a woman. Can't remember, I think her surname was Muir. Nothing's known about her. We don't know how it ended up there, except that is the oldest recorded version. So I've given it a wintry pine forest setting. It seemed sensible to me, for example, to have winter as the base because they're having hot porridge, which is when I eat hot porridge in the winter. Um, the pine forest could be in the UK, but it could be in Canada. So I was thinking about that when I was making these illustrations. So that's in there, and as I explained, I've made Goldilocks clearly the naughty one, and the bear's benevolent. Then we have the Gingerbread Man, and that was really interesting to research because the first published version is found in America in a journal or a magazine, and we think it probably travelled with settlers. It's very much in the European style of stories. There are many stories of runaway food, dumplings, whatever, but because it's first published in America, I gave it an American setting. I've always been interested in um, the American trains. When I was a child, I was obsessed with Casey Jones. It was my favorite TV show when I was a child. This dates me, I realize. It's an old black and white TV series. I could sing the theme tune for you, Nikki, but I'm not going to.
Me too. We could sing it together.
You could do a duet. Everyone of our generation probably remembers it. So the page you're looking up there is a little lino cut which I've stamped on of a characteristic American train with the cow catcher and the bell. Um, so those little things make it very personal to me because that's something that goes back to my childhood. This fascination with old American trains. After that, we have the Three Billy Goats Gruff. That was an easy choice to include because I've always loved that story, and I love the setting it in Norway with the big mountains and the old bridge. What was really interesting about that was designing, because when you make a book like this, you have to not only choose the stories but design the characters. You have to make the characters your version and decide what clothes they're going to wear and what their face is like, and all those little details. So I had to design my troll, and so I looked at Scandinavian sources, Norwegian sources, and tried to make my troll look how I imagine a Norwegian troll would be. And that was great fun. Actually, he was one of the most fun characters to create, and yeah,
I
I
love
really
this
enjoyed that
picture.
in there
I
as well.
love this picture.
I did have a lot of fun with that story. Also, because I think the technique I'm using here suits landscapes well.
Mm,
So this was an opportunity for me to really explore the landscape because there is a double page spread of a lovely big landscape. So I
mm.
enjoyed that. Then we have the enormous turnip, and that's another story I loved as a child. I had the Ladybird book, which I loved, and I also just really like the message in it, which is that nobody's too small to make a difference. I think that's a really great message to carry forward. Um, the history of this story is relatively straightforward. It was first published in Russia, collected by a famous story collector, Alexander Afanasiev, who was like the Russian version of the Grimm brothers. But it became particularly popular in Ukraine. A writer called Ivan Franko wrote a particularly popular version which I think is the source for a lot of the retellings that we have now, and including mine. So I've given it a Ukrainian setting. The costumes are Ukrainian rather than Russian. The architecture on the next page, I think it's the next page, is characteristically Ukrainian rather than Russian. It's only a subtle difference, but that's the sort of thing that interests me as an illustrator. Those are the sort of details to think about. So yeah, that was a great one to include. Then we have Little Red Riding Hood, and of course she has to be in there because it's such a popular story, such an iconic, famous story. This is one of the most difficult to retell, though, because if you go back to the sources, if you go back to the early versions,
Mm.
they are really quite dark, and Little Red Riding Hood and Grandma don't survive. Um, and then you get very, very modern versions in which neither of them get eaten; they just hide in cupboards. And I thought, well, that's not right either. There has to be some element of danger. So in my version, they do get eaten, but they are rescued by the woodcutter. As I explained in my version, he is Little Red Riding Hood's father. The wolf does get killed. So,
There's
it's
blood in it.
there's
There's
a drop of
blood.
blood. And actually, I hesitated over doing that. And I said to Janetta and Jude, if you don't like the drop of blood, you can digitally remove it.
I like the drop of blood.
But they were fine. They were great about it. I mean,
Mm.
that's what
Like you
you need.
say,
What
I
you need
mean,
in the
I
story.
don't know. Our audience might know. Let me just get it in the right place. There. Uh, Jack Sykes' book on the trials and tribulations of Little Red
Yes,
Riding Hood.
yes,
I mean, if we go back to those, Perrot's version, where Red Riding Hood really deserves her fate, as far as he's concerned.
absolutely. And those illustrations by Dore, where
Yeah.
she's actually in bed with the wolf. I mean, quite shocking and scandalous in a way.
And a
So,
somewhat knowing exchange of glance between those two characters
yes,
in
yes.
that
I mean,
version.
we're in Angela Carter territory, really, aren't we?
We are. Well, we don't get any of that. Let's just reassure our
Not in my
audience.
book,
We don't have
anyway. No,
any of that in here.
historically, yes, but my book is a nursery child friendly retelling, and then we have the tortoise and the hare, um, which obviously I wanted to set in a Greek landscape, and I really enjoyed the writing in this one. I liked making the tortoise talk slowly and little things like this with ellipses between all his words. So that's the sort of story where you can be really playful, and I think that one of the joys of retelling a story is that, and this is great for children to have a go at, is that you already know the story. So you haven't got to make it up. You can play with language and you can experiment with how you tell the story. So that's why storytelling becomes important, which I know we're going to come on to in a moment. And yeah, the tortoise and the hare was a really fun one to tell in terms of the words. Illustratively, um, I found it quite difficult, actually, if I'm honest, because you have to show this journey, and the spread you're holding up now was one of my solutions. It was showing a long winding path over different territories, but it was challenging. Particularly with using collage, I found that one of the harder ones to illustrate. I'm not saying I didn't enjoy it, but it was one of the more challenging ones. And then we have the Three Little Pigs and the Big Bad Wolf, which we know is an English story. So it starts with rain, characteristic English weather. If you go back a page, you'll see the three pigs leaving home under some rain clouds.
There we are.
And that kind of made sense to me, not just because of it being set in England, but also because there needed to be a reason why they were building these houses, obviously. So if it's not very nice weather, then they need shelter. So that, I mean, I don't say that in the retelling, but I think all these things as an illustrator matter to me because it's what makes me think out how to do the illustrations. So then the next spread is the three houses, of course, the straw and the wood and the brick. The hardest thing for that, and actually one of the hardest things in the whole book, was designing those three pigs and particularly their clothes. And there were many, many different permutations of them. At one point, they were dressed in very fancy clothes, and it just didn't sit right. It just didn't look right. But that's how they ended up. And also a different big bad wolf, because obviously had one big bad wolf
Oh, yes.
I had to come up with a slightly different character for this big bad wolf, who does get away alive. He doesn't perish. In some versions, he does. In my version, he doesn't. Um, Great fun with him because he's just such a funny sort of character, and I like the fact that with this collage you can sometimes get away with being almost symbolic with the illustrations.
Mm,
So, like the image of him going down the chimney, all you see is a pair of legs and lots of smoke, and the
mm,
rest is left to your imagination. And I like being able to play with the illustrations, do things like that. So that was fun. And then the last story in the book is probably the least well known, unless we have any Spaniards watching. It's called The Vain Little Mouse, or in Spanish, um, La Ratoncita Presumida, and which literally is the presumptuous mouse, really. Um, it's interesting in Spanish. Raton is rat, but ratoncito is little rat as a mouse, and and I discovered this story. Obviously, I'm married to a Spaniard, so I heard this story in Spain, and I just thought that's really, really charming. I'd love to be able to illustrate that one day, but I didn't think I'd be able to do it as a book on its own. It didn't think it was well known enough here, but to include it in an anthology like this works really well, and it's an absolutely charming little story. I think I just love it.
mm. It was a surprise for me. Obviously, I know the other stories in the collection really well, and then I got to this one, and I thought, it was such a delight to discover what was for me a new story. And I know you're going to treat us to a storytelling, which is why I haven't shown the illustrations of this one. So I'm going to hand over to you to tell us the story of the vain little mouse.
Okay, thank you, Nikki. Not so long ago, in Spain, there lived a mouse, and she was the most beautiful little mouse you ever saw. She had the pinkest ears, the pinkest nose, and the pinkest tail. And she lived in a little white house surrounded by geraniums. Let's see what she looks like. Here she is. And she was very vain. She also was very house proud, and she spent all her days brushing and sweeping her house to keep it clean and spotless. And as she swept and cleaned, she would say, "Look at me. I'm the prettiest little mouse. I'm the prettiest little mouse in my pretty little house." Now, nearby, there lived another mouse, and he did not have pink ears, or a pink nose, or a pink tail, and he was very poor. His name was Senor Perez. And he said, "Oh, Senorita, you're such a beautiful mouse. Please, will you marry me?" Well, the vain little mouse didn't think that Senor Perez was good enough for her. So she put her nose in the air and said, "Of course I won't marry you." And she carried on sweeping the floor. Well, as she swept, one day she found a coin, a nice golden coin, and she thought, "I'm going to go to town and buy myself something special. Should I buy a new broom to sweep the floor, or maybe some nice new dusters for the windows?" Then she thought, "No, I'm going to go and buy myself a red ribbon for my tail." So off she went to town, and she went to the finest store and chose the best possible red silk ribbon, and she tied it to her tail. And now she thought, "Look at me. I really am the most beautiful mouse in the world." And she probably was. Now, on the way home, suddenly up popped a chicken. There he is. And he saw the vain little mouse and he said, "Oh my goodness, you really are the most beautiful little mouse I've ever seen." He said, "Will you marry me?" And the vain little mouse said, "Well, that all depends. Will you sing to me by the light of the moon?" And the cockerel said, "Yes, of course I will. I'll sing like this: Cock-a-doodle-doo, by the light of the moon, cock-a-doodle-doo, I will marry you soon." And the vain little mouse said, "Oh, no, you won't, not with a terrible voice like that. Goodbye." And she trotted off down the road. At which point, a donkey appeared. And he said, "Oh my goodness, I've never seen such a beautiful little mouse in all my life." He said, "You're so beautiful. Will you marry me?" And the vain little mouse said, "Well, that all depends. Will you sing to me by the light of the moon?" And the donkey said, yes, of course I would. I will sing like this. Hee-haw, by the light of the moon. Hee-haw, will you marry me soon? And the little mouse said, no, I will not. That's a terrible voice. Get out of here. So the poor donkey scuttled off down the road, and the vain little mouse went on her way. And she got a little bit further down the road when there appeared a very handsome, very smart, and elegant cat. And the cat said, oh my goodness, I have never seen such a beautiful little mouse ever. Will you marry me? And the mouse said, well, that all depends. Will you sing to me by the light of the moon? And the cat said, of course I will. Meow, meow, meow. Meow, meow, meow. Oh, more, more, said the vain little mouse. That's so beautiful. Meow, 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 said the cat. More, said the mouse. Meow, meow, meow. By the light of the moon. Meow, meow, meow. I will gobble you soon. Well, just at that moment, who should appear but Senor Perez? And he grabbed the vain little mouse by the hand, and they scurried away before the cat could eat them. And then he said, I know my ears are not pink, and I know I am poor, but I really do love you. Will you marry me? And the vain little mouse said, will you sing to me by the light of the moon? And Senor Perez said, good grief, no, of course I won't. I'll be fast asleep. And the vain little mouse said, in that case, I will. And they got married that very night by the light of the moon, all dressed in ribbons and lace. And they went to live in the little white house surrounded by geraniums. And every day the vain little mouse swept the floor. She never did find another coin, so they were not rich. But even so, they did live happily ever after.
Oh, James, that was a lovely bedtime story. But, we've got 15 minutes to go. I was just thinking, I feel so relaxed now. What a gorgeous story. I wonder whether, the town mouse and the country mouse, I know it's not the same story, but I do wonder whether somewhere in the past there's a connection. That's an Aesop story, isn't it?
I'm sure there are absolutely, yes, I'm sure there must be connections to all these stories. The more you research, the more you find variations all over the world. There are variations with this story as well. In South America, they tell a version where it's believe it or not, it's a vain cockroach. And in another version, the mouse does get eaten by the cat. And Senor Perez, who first appears in a version of the story, as he does in mine, has gone off to have a life of his own. I found this book just last week when I was in Barcelona, El Ratoncito Perez. So this is his story, and in this story, which is an authored tale, a more modern story, he's the Spanish tooth fairy. So
Ah.
all these varieties and variations of stories exist out there, and they all link to others, and I find it just endlessly fascinating, because ultimately we can't say this is the absolute version. Um, this is how it should be. We can't say that with these stories. And I think that's one of the reasons why they survive, because every new storyteller can bring their own spin to it.
Mm. I love your props there. I feel there's a whole new industry in making props for your stories that could be used in classrooms.
Well, I'm going to have a word with Janetta actually, because I just made these this afternoon. I thought, how am I going to tell this story and make it interesting? Maybe we can come up with some designs like this and put them on the website so teachers can download them. I think that would be a really lovely thing, so that you can make almost like a little puppet show to help teachers and children with their storytelling skills.
Mm. And of course, that in a way, it's what they do in Japan with their komishibai
Yes.
theatre, the way
Yeah.
that they tell a book, as it were.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. Wonderful. Yes.
Mm.
That's a perfect example.
And because this is about reading stories, with the collection, but story reading and storytelling can go hand in hand. And do you think it's important for teachers to be able to tell a story without having the book, if you like, as that not a barrier, but It's more direct, isn't it, to tell a story to children? Do you think it's important to do that?
Well, it certainly is for me. I mean, I've been visiting schools now for over 30 years. And when I first started, I was not a storyteller and I was very self conscious and awkward. And I didn't really know how to work in schools. And I would obediently read from the printed text in books. And I found that I was very stilted doing that. I felt very static and I felt under a great deal of pressure because obviously, if you stumble on a sentence and get it wrong, then you've spoiled it really. Whereas if you're telling a story from memory, you can quickly change and move in different directions, and you're not stuck. You're not imprisoned by the printed published text. You can be freer. And if you're working with a particular class and maybe you're just sensing that they're not really enjoying that particular detail, you move on to the next bit or emphasize something else that might be more exciting for them. So you can be flexible with that storytelling. But it took me many, many, many years to learn to do that and to feel confident about it. So if I think it's important, I think it's useful. I don't think it's essential. I wouldn't want to say to all teachers, you must do this. I would never say that. But I think if it's something that they are interested in, then that's something I would love to help them find their own way. And I think that's what I've done. I mean, quite often I do illustrations live alongside the storytelling. So I kind of hide behind the pictures in a way. Tonight I've hidden behind the puppets. So I like a prop or a thing to support my storytelling. um, I think that it's something you have to find your own way into.
Let's have a look at these pictures that you sent me. So, tell us where these are from.
So a couple of weeks ago, I had a book launch here where I live, a little town called Bungay in Suffolk, and there's a wonderful shop that's opened quite recently. It's called Fuzzy Peg Folk, and Fuzzy Peg is named after the hedgehog in the Little Grey Rabbit books. If anybody remembers those, and this is the most magical shop. It's my favorite shop in the world. It's full of extraordinary toys collected from all over the world, but mostly from Eastern Europe, actually, mostly from countries like Poland and Romania and Ukraine. And they're absolutely exquisite. And the owner of the shop, Catherine, is a fantastic woman, and we've often chatted about how we could collaborate. So when the book was coming out, I said maybe we could do a book launch for this book, and she jumped on the idea. And she did these fantastic window displays, and she found all these gorgeous wooden toy animals. Here we've got the three little pigs with a wooden house, which she put together. There we've got three billy goats and even a little troll under a bridge. And the boxes of matches have got tortoises on, and there's a little hare. I mean, the detail that she went into, the things that she thought of, it's just extraordinary that she went to so much trouble. And we had a wonderful evening. Loads of people turned up, and I did some more live storytelling, and there were giveaways. And it was just really, really a magical evening. And it's so lovely to see all these sort of props because it makes me realize how useful they can be actually with storytelling. So I'm sure lots of people watching and listening right now will be familiar with story sacks or story bags, and these are the ideal kind of stories for that sort of thing because it's quite easy. It's relatively easy to find three teddy bears and a doll for Goldilocks and the Three Bears. And as I hope I've demonstrated with my little puppets tonight, it's actually very helpful when you're trying to communicate a story to have these visual aids, these props. So here's a window with Goldilocks and Three Bears, as I just mentioned.
Just gorgeous.
Yeah, yeah, and there's a fantastic, a very naughty-looking wolf there that she found, and a Little Red Riding Hood doll, and autumn leaves, just like in the book, because I've set my version in autumn with poisonous mushrooms around the wolf to emphasise the suggestion of danger. So I love hiding these little clues in the
Mm,
illustrations, and she's picked up on that with the autumn leaves. So
mm,
yeah, it was a wonderful evening, magical evening, and it's really made me think of how useful these props, whether you make your own little cardboard cutout puppets like I did for tonight, whether you can source things. Um, Very easy to get the kids to maybe make some gingerbreads like here. This is one of the toys I bought from her shop actually because I just couldn't resist it. It's a little old Polish pull along toy. I can't pull it along because I haven't got a tabletop right here to show you, but if you pull it along, then they wiggle around and move and nod to
oh,
each other. And so there's a cheeky little wolf and a sweet little Red Riding Hood. And the other
gorgeous.
toy. um, which she gave me as a gift, which I absolutely adore. And this really demonstrates how old these stories are and how far-reaching they are. This is an antique toy of the enormous turnip from the USSR, so it's really quite old now. So there's a little turnip at the front, and there's the farmer, his wife, the daughter, the dog, the cat, and the mouse. And what I love about that is that's exactly the same sequence of characters that's in my retelling. My retelling. Lots of different versions have a different conglomeration of characters helping to pull out the turnip. But by pure chance and coincidence, this is this is the cast of my retelling. So I love that little
That's
toy
gorgeous.
from
I
probably
I
50s.
just absolutely fabulous. I thought for any teachers that are watching, I'd flag up a few books about storytelling. They're all quite old, but if you can get hold of copies, I absolutely love this book by Edie Garvey, which is Story as Vehicle. She also had, working from the 1950s to the 1980s, she really believed in the importance of storytelling for, particularly in multilingual classrooms, and for developing language and the acquisition of language. It's a completely inspirational read, and that is a younger Grace Hallworth, who I mentioned earlier on. Also from the library's background, from the Thimble Press, Nancy and Aidan Chambers. Again, Eileen Colwell was from a library's background. This basically little more than a pamphlet, but lots of great tips for teachers as storytellers. And then perhaps a little more recently, Jack Sipes' book on creative storytelling. So sorry, James, I hope you didn't mind. I took 30 seconds to
No,
flag some of
no.
those up.
I think it's wonderful. I think it's great to encourage people to do this, and I think that any aid, any book, anything that encourages and supports is a fantastic thing. I mean, it's honestly not that difficult. As I said before, I started out very insecure and very unsure of myself in schools. Um, but the key thing is just to learn the stories and to want to tell them. Choose stories that you love, you want to tell, you want to share with your kids, whether you're a parent or a teacher or whoever you are. And I think once you have that knowledge, once you have the story clear in your head, um, then you can play with it. And I think what's really interesting about doing storytelling is that sometimes I do get lost in the middle. Sometimes I do get stuck. And I think it's really good for the brain to have to sort of think, okay, which story am I telling? What happens next? And solve that little. There's a lot of problem solving when you're telling a story. It's a great workout for the brain. It's probably better than Sudoku. I don't know, but it's certainly I think an element of it that I actually quite enjoy. I enjoy that challenge. It's a little bit like a mathematical equation. You sort of get so far into the story and you think, okay, so I've got to remember to bring that bit in, otherwise it won't all add up at the end. And I think that's a great thing for teachers to learn to do, and to pass on to children, for them to develop those critical thinking skills that you have to bring to the front of your mind on the spot because you're telling a story.
Mm, excellent. So we are going to have a look at inside the book. Obviously, I was holding it up earlier, but we've got some slides. I'm going to whiz through the first ones to get to the Three Billy Goats Gruff, because I know that's a story you particularly
Mm,
wanted to talk about. So everybody's going to see a quick insides of some of the earlier stories there. And here we are, the Three Billy Goats Gruff. I know that you particularly, I love the colours in this. And one of the things that struck me, that although they all have their own flavour and they all have their own visual flavour, the book has a unity about it. So when you look at your sun and your birds as motifs that are threaded through all of the stories, there's a kind of unity created by some of those elements, and the birds are here in this picture.
mm. I think that this collage technique that I developed first for Mrs. Noah's Pockets some years ago now, and I call it my Otterberry technique because I've only used it for Otterberry books projects. I think because you're using I'm using printed textures. I use lino cuts, and I print them and repeat them. I've got some of the lino cuts here, for example. I don't know if they'll show up very well on the screen here, but I mean they are. This one's just sort of random marks, really, but this can be useful. It can be clouds in the sky, it can be water, it could be the hair on a troll. It's just useful in many, many different ways. So that gives everything a unity, a cohesion. So you'll see some of the same textures here in this image on the fur of the goats, in the clouds in the sky, the water, and the rocks, and actually the trees as well. So that holds everything together, and in different colours, and sometimes printed on top of, again with a different texture. These patterns will appear in other stories too. So that does pull everything together, I think. However free and different an individual illustration within a particular story might be. So that's something I really love about this. It also makes me think very differently working collage, because you can move things around. You can change the composition. If you're drawing something and you change your mind about it, well, um, because I don't work digitally, I can't really change anything. I would have to start again. But with collage, unless I've glued something, I can keep on moving things around more or less indefinitely. I mean, obviously, I have a delivery date, but just before I reach the panic stage for finishing a book, there's time to move things and play, and I can put the tree in a different place, or I'll make the river flow in a different direction, or add more trees, or take trees away, or the birds can move. There can be fewer clouds or more clouds. The goats could be in a different order. All of those things can change, and that gives me a great deal of freedom, a great deal of creativity. So I begin to think more about the drama of the image. Really, I suppose it's almost like a theatrical setting, and you're moving the things around like puppets within it. So if I want to create a particular um, atmosphere or sense of drama, then I can move things in order to be able to do that. And this is a case in point, actually. Where do I put the little baby goat? This is the smallest goat on the bridge to create the most drama. And I did try him in different positions, but he looked most vulnerable over there, leering away from the troll. This is the first appearance of the troll. Um, and I think also with this technique, you can compositionally you can be quite simple. There's a lot of white space around that, but it says everything it needs to say, and that works really well with this age group, I think, and with these retellings. It gives the book a freshness, and Janetta kindly said that it had a sort of a contemporary feel. I mean, everything's given a traditional setting, but the style of the illustrations, the technique, does give everything a freshness and a modernity compared to my other work that I used to do and still sometimes do using more traditional things like pen and ink. So I think that's really important for me as an illustrator to have been able to achieve, because I don't work digitally. There's a lot of digital illustration out there. It creates a certain um, effect very often, and my very, very, very traditional pen and ink line work and lots of details and stuff, I felt was getting a bit lost in that world. So I think this has kind of freshened my work up, if you like, and given it, I hope, a bit of a new lease of life. This is one of my favorites in the book. I just love this moment. You're seeing the whole illustration here, not cropped. It's slightly cropped in the book, because when you do an illustration, you have to have extra illustration so it can be moved around and just put into exactly the place that the designer, Jude in this case, feels it should be in. Um, but there goes the troll. The big troll has whacked him off the bridge, and there he goes tumbling down into all my lino cut water. Um, and yeah, that is one of my absolute favourites in the book. That one.
Mm. You talked, I mean, we've obviously seen your collage work in several books now, from Mrs. Noah to your Symphony of Stories, and so on. This felt to me like it was a bit more pared back, that there was more white space. I haven't gone back and checked that, but I felt that looking at it. Is that the case? Because it allows a young reader to focus on the really important parts of the story.
Yes, absolutely. It's exactly right. There is more white space. It was a deliberate decision. I wanted things to feel fresh, clean, easy to read, simple. Within the illustrations, there's lots of details, and the illustrations are often very, very rich because of all these layered textures and patterns. But I wanted there to be this space on a page, so that children didn't get sort of overwhelmed by messy graphic design or overwhelming illustrations. There might be overwhelming moments like the troll tumbling off the bridge, but I wanted the book to feel um, inviting in a sort of clean, fresh, open way.
Mm. We're going to look at one more story, and then there is a question in the Q&A, so I'm going to come to that and make sure we've just got a few minutes at the end for that. But I know that you were quite keen to talk about the enormous turnip as well, so that's the next one in the collection.
Yeah, I mean, again, this was a favourite of mine. I love the story, and I loved the Ukrainian setting. It was really interesting to do the research into the style of the costumes and stuff. So here I've used some fabric. I've used ribbon for the waistcoat of the farmer here, and I've used lace on the buildings. So being playful and trying different materials like this was really great fun. And I think it's a wonderful project for children to have a go at. Even children who feel they can't draw will be able to have a go at collage. And sometimes, if you prepare lots of interesting papers in advance, the papers themselves suggest things to you. So sometimes I produce a specific paper. I think, well, I need green leaves. I'm painting this paper green. I'm putting this texture on it. That will look like leaves. And that makes sense. Sometimes you do need a particular thing, like the tiles on the roof in the house here. But other times I might be doing particularly a landscape. This is something that happens a lot with landscapes, is you just see a bit of paper lying on the floor that's got dropped. And you think, ooh, oh, that looks like a tree. I quite like that. And it might not be the colour you were thinking of for a tree. It might be orange or red. And you suddenly think, oh, maybe I could set it in autumn. I like that. That's a really interesting texture. That works really well. So there's a sort of mixture between things that surprise you and are accidental and things that you plan and make for a specific purpose. But both those things, both those thought processes are useful and interesting. And I think collage work is a great way of getting children to make art. They can do it collaboratively, they can do it independently, and I think also teachers can join in and help and support, of course. But I think that it's just a great way to encourage children to be creative without having to rely on skills that some children may feel they don't have.
Mm.
This is again another favorite image in the book. I like this almost symmetry of it. It looks a lot like a sort of a piece of folk art. So folk art, traditional folk art, in this case obviously Ukrainian, was a big influence on the style of the book. And again, I felt that using these quite simple compositions and the techniques with the printing and the lino cutting really captured a kind of folk art, folksy feel, which is exactly what I wanted for these folk tales.
There we are.
Mm.
So I think we've just got a little time left, and Kelly would like to know if you had an opportunity to retell more tales, maybe there's space for nursery tales too. What would you choose? What didn't make the cut but you would like to
Well,
include?
there's so many I would like to do. I mean, I would be interested in looking at the fairy tale side of things, which obviously I haven't done. But if we stuck with nursery tales, I mean, the Magic Porridge Pot was a favourite of mine as a child. It didn't go in because it's not an animal story, and we wanted to keep this animal based, as I said. The Town Musicians of Bremen is a story I love, as I mentioned earlier.
Mm.
There are a great many stories. I don't think the Seven Little Kids will go in though, because I still don't like that one. Still makes me very unsettled. But there are lots and lots and lots of them, which I could include. But the Magic Porridge Pot would be the number one. That would be the first I would include. Love that story.
Interesting. And if it were fairy tales, what would be top of your pick?
Well, if we looked at traditional tales as fairy tales, in other words, the sort of ancient ones that don't necessarily have an author, um, I love Beauty and the Beast. I'm fascinated by the Arabian Nights, the Thousand and One Nights. Um, and there are some really beautiful, unusual stories from other countries. I know a gorgeous Spanish story, The Orange Princess. There are lots of gorgeous Italian folk tales. Italo Calvino did a marvelous collection
Mm.
of Italian folk tales. I'd love to look at something like that. Tales from the Alhambra, I've been reading recently. They're really interesting. There's a couple of gorgeous fairy tales in there, which I would love to do. But among the classics, I think the obvious ones, Beauty and the Beast, would be probably a first choice. I love that, partly because when I was quite young, I saw Cocteau's gorgeous film La Belle et la Bête, which has remained one of my all-time favourite films. So I'm a little influenced by that.
Mm.
Yeah, so yeah, so much to
Amazing.
choose from. So many wonderful stories out there.
James, I'm so sad that our evening has to come to a close, but you've given us lots to think about, and a really good insight to this very rich collection. And as always, it's a huge pleasure to talk to you.
It's been a joyful evening. I can't believe it's whizzed by so fast.
Oh,
But I want to say a huge thank you to Janetta and Jude and all the team at Otterbury. Obviously, a huge thank you to you, Nikki, for supporting me again with this. And another huge thank you to everyone who's joined in tonight. Um, I've loved making this book and I've loved revisiting my memories of these stories. And I'm really excited to see this book going out into the world and hopefully being read by a new generation of children and helping them make their memories of these stories.
lovely. So, goodbye from us then, everyone, and hope to see you again soon.
Bye, everyone. Thank you
Bye.
very much.